Good afternoon. My name is Annika Betancourt. I'm a visiting fellow with the Center for East Asia Policy. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I'm joined by four very distinguished panelists. Immediately to my left is Dr. Melly Caballero-Anthony. She's a professor of international relations at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and an expert on non-traditional security threats. Thank you for being with us. Next to her is Dr. Suh-Yong, who is a professor and director of the Center for Global Climate and Marine Governance at Korea University in Seoul. He's also advises the government of the Republic of Korea and came to Brookings directly from COP25 in Madrid, so we're glad to have him. Also joined by Dr. Leonardo Martinez-Diaz, who is currently the global director of the Sustainable Finance Center at the World Resource Institute and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Energy and Environment. Thank you for being with us. Finally, last but not least, certainly, is Sherry Goodman, who is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Polar Institute. Also, she was a former first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and we're very delighted to have her with us today. So just to start us off, one of the reasons why we wanted to hold this forum was to talk about, as Jung said, climate changed. And so the Asia Pacific is regularly identified as one of the regions that is already hardest hit by the effects of climate change. And obviously these effects carry very important regional and global implications. So I wanted to just give a couple of short data points before we start with our panelists to just give you a snapshot of the situation in the region. For instance, Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing economic regions in the world. Growing population urbanization suggests that electricity demand is expected to triple between 2015 and 2040. Just a couple of countries in the region, 70% of Vietnam's population lives along its 2,000 meter coastline. And Indonesia has a population of 264 million and one of the world's longest coastlines of 34,000 miles. In the Philippines, 22,000 mile long coastline and 100 million people. And just for reference, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines are somewhere about $2,000 to $3,000 GDP per capita. And as a frame of reference, the ROK's GDP per capita is around 30,000 US dollars, and Australia is 53,000. The number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes have increased by 75% or more since 1970 in this region, as well as the increase in the destructiveness. So it's just a couple of data points. I'd like to turn it over to each of my colleagues here to give some initial comments, and then we'll come back and ask some questions and get some questions from the audience. Let's start with Sherry.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you. I'm going to let you tee up the slides here. So I'm Sherry Goodman, and it's great to be here at Brookings with you all. Let me thank the great Brookings team, General Allen, Young, Annika, the whole team here. Ambassador, very nice to have you here. Korea Foundation, thank you, obviously, for your support. I was really interested. First, let me say, I always start with the bluff, the bottom line up front, right? I spent a lot of time in the Department of Defense with our military, and I'm so pleased that you used the phrase that I coined now 13 years ago, almost threat multiplier. With the first group of military leaders, I would put General Allen, who was on active duty at the time we formed the Military Advisory Board in 2007, but among the cohort of like-minded leaders, first U.S., but now international, who understand the seriousness of the climate threat and characterize it as a threat multiplier. Indeed, when we issued our first report in 2007, right after that, Ambassador, came the first UN Security Council report discussion about climate change as a security issue, and that has led to many of the actions that you have documented since then. Of course, that is, of course, not enough. So, my second bluff is that Asia is on the front line of climate threats globally. And that's why I think this conference is really important. And then third, what can we do about it? And that's improved predictive capabilities and climate-proofing solutions. Now, let's see. What do I need to do here? My slides are not as good as yours, Ambassador. So, but you really told a lot of the story. But I want to start, the major issues facing the region. We've already talked about those. I want to put this in some historical context. You showed a slide, Madam Ambassador, from back to 94, the first UN Security Council debate. Well, in 1995, I held the first Asia-Pacific Environmental Security Forum with then PACOM Commander Admiral Preer. Some of you might remember him going back, way back then. He was our Pacific Area Commander. And so our military, the United States military, has a long history of engagement in the region on environmental issues. We didn't frame it as climate change then. We weren't quite that smart. But we were working on a range of issues having to do with water, energy, natural resources protection, cleaning up contaminated sites across the region, and generally elevating discussion and opportunities better to integrate institutions, the military with its foreign ministries, with its environmental ministries, with its finance ministries across a range of countries and domains. And so now, fast forward, these are the major issues, facing the region today. And it's all framed in this administration, framed by sort of great power competition, but underlying and driving a lot of that is the food and water insecurity, and of course, the disaster risk. So, now what we see is the sea level rise being a major source of threat in the region, flooding, rising sea surface temperatures, ocean acidification, and then changing climate circulation patterns, I think, is really important. We're beginning to understand more about that, but I think there's still a lot we don't know about the El Nino and La Nina cycles, how they affect that. But our ability better to understand that will enable us in the future to have better predictive capabilities in the region. Okay, it's we sometimes refer to as disaster alley. So in the region, disaster risks are rising, and that makes people more vulnerable because they're increasingly exposed to these hazards. And this is a sort of way of framing that hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, and the impacts. And we see those rising, globally, but especially in the Asia-Pacific region. So we now have 4 out of 5 people affected by natural disasters live in Asia. And you could see that the percent of the world's total, many of them are in the Asia-Pacific region. And your slides, Madam Ambassador, showed that in a very vivid and important way. One thing we should not underestimate is the impact on global food and fish stocks of climate threats. Ocean acidification, rising temperatures, migration of fish stocks, and now, newer findings that the availability of key omega-3 fatty acids could be declining with the changes in ocean temperature. And this is, as you see, this chart shows you various RCP scenarios and the effect on global fish stocks. Not to forget the migration northward of many of the global fish stocks towards the poles. Last week, I testified before in the Senate on the Arctic, and of course, we have a fishing moratorium today in the Central Arctic Ocean, but many wonder whether China's interest in the Arctic is in part motivated by the future prize of a vibrant fishery in that region. So we see this is going to have global impacts in many ways, and that just exacerbates the challenges for our Coast Guard friends. I saw some of them here at lunch who have the mandate, along with others around the world, to address illegal and unregulated fishing. Okay, well, this is just a snapshot, a bit of an eye chart of the climate hotspots across the region. Some of you have probably seen this slide before, but it shows you that there's no lack of challenges across the region. So at the Wilson Center, one of the places where I now am, along with the Center for Climate Security, over the last couple of years, we've been running an effort to improve our predictive capabilities for disruptive weather and water and climate security events by integrating sort of our understanding of the natural system changes, the ecosystem changes, along with transnational threats and security threats, and to get a more integrated framework. And we've done 4 case studies now. I'll talk just briefly about 2. We did one on South Asia and Pakistan, looking at the climate threats there, and you can see how in this part of the region you have a lot of climate insecurities, got a lot of drought combined with flooding, Himalayas, the water tower of Asia. As that changes, that's going to make many more people water insecure across the region. And you see some now new elevation data. I'm going to show you a little bit more in a moment about how Mumbai, just as an example, a megacity, could be very much underwater in coming years. Now, we recently took a deeper dive into the COFA states. Somebody asked about the COFA states here in the Asia-Pacific region, the Marshall Islands, along with Federated States of Micronesia, to look at a combined set of threats in this region, both the increasing presence of China in the region, but also, and the COFA states, our arrangements with the COFA states come up for negotiations within the coming years. And what are their major challenges? Many of them food and water insecurity driven by climate change. And how can we better shape our engagements? We did this with Indo-PACOM, J9, as well as NOAA and other U.S. federal agencies, and looking at this integrated set of risks. So here you see the A2AD outer island chain and a combined set of risks. We're trying to better combine and at the same time disaggregate these complex compounding risks in the region. And we just need to underscore, I think, that migration and climate migration, and Ambassador, you said it very well, this region is going to be at the front line of a new generation of climate migration, and we don't currently today have the legal mechanisms to address it, to address the sovereignty of nations, of people who will be displaced, and to manage that. And that is one deeply personal to me. My parents were Holocaust refugees, and they were fortunate enough to come here and to be able to live their lives. And many of the legal mechanisms we have in place here today are those that we put in place after World War II to deal with the refugee crisis as we understood it at the time. And we need to really think about how we update that, and I was very interested in the solutions that you put forward there, Madam Ambassador. I'm going to move right on to this next set, because I know my time is running out, but I think this new elevation data that's come out is important for people who are working in this space to know about, and I have to thank Climate Central and my colleagues over there. This shows you this new data, the increased number of people that are going to be at risk from annual floods in a number of countries across the Asia-Pacific region, and the numbers are quite significant. The increased exposure to many cities, many key populated cities in the region. And just in as an example, land below the projected flood level in 2050 in Bangkok, Thailand, with this new data, you see many, many cities much more at risk. And if you want to take a deeper dive into it, you could go and look at all these data sources. That's where it comes from. And with that, I'm going to get off the stage and look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A session.
We'll go with Leonardo.
I'll do it from here, that's all right. Thank you for taking on this issue. It is absolutely crucial, and the connections between climate change and security are now becoming more and more clear. I think after Sherry's excellent presentation, you will begin to feel a bit overwhelmed, and that's always the impression one feels after just even a casual survey of the compounding damages and the risks. And so one of the crucial things we need to do, both as policy students, policy makers, and as a general public, is to figure out how do we come up with a positive, concrete agenda for action that, of course, that includes cutting emissions, because there is no adapting to a 5-degree world, and probably even not to a 3-degree world. But we have to come up with, as we cut emissions, we also have to come up with ways to begin to absorb, reduce, and bounce from the damage, bounce back from the damage. And that means thinking more deeply about a policy agenda for building resilience. And that's what my co-author Alice Hill and I do in a recent book, Building a Resilient Tomorrow. We lay out 10 lessons that we have learned so far on how to build resilience. The focus is on the United States, but I think those lessons are easily exportable to other parts of the world. Let me give you just a flavor of a couple of those lessons that build on very much the agenda that Sherry just set out. The first is about building more resiliently around the world. This is especially important in Asia, which has, of course, some of the largest cities and urban environments in the world. And I think this lesson is about how do we build more smartly, and how do we build for the future, not just the past. It's pretty clear now that the future will not resemble the past in terms of climate, in terms of all the parameters that we currently use to design, site, and build infrastructure. And so now we have to begin to think about what are these structures going to be withstanding? Where do we place them so they will be at lower risk? And how do we make sure that this applies not just to key military and political facilities, but that they also include the vast majority of commercial and residential structures that are the heart of the economy in most places. So what this means is we need, first of all, a land use policy, building codes, and zoning regulations that set up a clear boundary about where not to go, right? Where are the safe zones? Where are the unsafe areas? We need to broadcast to the public, to developers, to real estate, the real estate community, to villages and cities about the importance of planning in a way that is future informed. And that means governments have to come up with flood maps, they have to come up with risk maps, and to develop a hazard matrix that allows all of these different decision makers across the economy to make good decisions about where to build. And we need to have building codes that are enforced, not only that they're good, but also enforced. The story of Houston, I think, is informative. The city of Houston in Texas, of course, had a policy of pretty lax building codes. It allowed folks to build pretty much wherever they wanted. And over time, you had a vast city that was very dynamic economically. But then when Hurricane Harvey arrived in 2017, it dumped 50 inches of rain in just a few hours, causing massive flooding and enormous damage. Very shortly after that, the city got together and passed some of the most stringent building codes in the United States. And whether they will be enforced and how they will be enforced remains to be seen. But it's clear that cities, even those that before were not embracing strong building codes, are beginning to do so. And in Asia, of course, the systems in every country, every city are different because of the politics and the governance and the history. But the overall message here is clear. We have to build for the future. The second lesson that I want to leave you with is about data. We need to get the data, but we need to make it usable. Today, we collect more climate and weather data than we ever have in the history of humanity, right? Just NOAA alone collects terabytes of data, enough to fill over 7,000 90-minute Netflix videos a day, right? And that's just one agency. And so the problem isn't so much collecting more. We will continue to do that. The problem is how do you boil that down and turn it into decision-ready data that folks can use in businesses, in cities, in communities. And that means not just getting the right data to the right folks, it means doing so in an interface that doesn't require a PhD to understand, right? And that's true in Vietnam as it is in the United States. We still have not cracked that yet. There were, during the Obama administration, I recall, lots of efforts to try to increase access to data, lots of clearinghouses and places, platforms online to get the data. But in the end, it can be quite overwhelming, especially if you're working in a small city or in a small business with limited resources. So we need to be able to do that. There's some excellent technological capacity now that can help us do that, but we need the political will to build these interfaces and to ensure that the cost of the data is accessible. Of course, the private sector will create very fancy proprietary tools for big business to understand what's happening to its supply chains and so on. But we need to make sure there's a platform of accessible, free or very low-cost data that people can use. Third lesson, really quickly, is about finance. We need to make markets work for resilience. And that means we need to make sure that prices begin to capture climate risk. And currently, they're not really doing so. In real estate, we're beginning to see a signal, a price signal, in places like Florida, like New York. We've detected now a price differential between 6 and 7% of discount that properties in risky areas appear to be incurring in the market. But stocks and bonds, insurance premiums, all of these things do not yet fully reflect the magnitude of the risk. And that is true in the United States, as it is true in many parts of the world that have even less well-functioning markets. So we need to figure out, in those places where the markets are already quite sophisticated and deep, how do we ensure that climate risk is increasingly reflected? And that is, of course, quite important because it then drives prices, then begin to drive decisions to buy and sell, insurance and bonds and stocks and real estate. And that, of course, leads over time to reward those players that are building resilience and to signal to others that this is dangerous, right? And you probably shouldn't be buying that property or shouldn't be investing in that company. Finally, and Sherry already alluded to this, is the real pickle of relocation. How do you resettle people, not just individuals in individual households, from one place to another, but how do you move communities, entire communities, to other places? There are places that are worth protecting, where you can build more seawalls, more mangroves, more infrastructure to protect the assets. But then there are places that simply will not be economically feasible to protect. And the question is, how do we do that? And how do we do it gradually, with plenty of time, with preparation, so that the relocation, which is inherently going to be traumatic, is not the kind of human tragedy that we saw in Katrina, in New Orleans during Katrina, in the Philippines during Typhoon Haiyan, right? And that means there are some experiments already in the United States. We've seen this done in Louisiana in a small scale, in Alaska. So far, moving whole villages is enormously expensive. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars per person. And so until we're able to reduce those costs and figure out more efficient ways to do this, it's going to be quite difficult. We do have in the United States a buyout program that allows the government to individually sort of buy people's homes and allow them to relocate. But that is very, very slow. And in many places, folks don't want to leave. They are naturally attached by history, by culture to a place, and they will not take the buyout. So we need to think of more community-oriented ways to convince folks that moving as a group is a logical thing. Politically, this will mean that we need politicians all the way to the local level who are willing to engage communities in a dialogue about this issue. And the earlier, the better.
Thank you. Dr. Chung?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to Brookings. I was flying from Madrid. Actually, I couldn't see the final moment of the climate change meeting because of my travel scheduled here. Even if we were expecting to seal the final deal in Madrid, but actually things have been postponed to Glasgow next year. And then that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a hopeless thing, but I think we are just taking some moments actually to find out a better solution. So no deal is better than the no action. So that's the motto that we found in Madrid. By the way, This is my second coming to Washington, D.C. In a conference on climate change with the support of Korean Foundation. And then today's theme is the Asia Transnational Threat Forum and Climate Security in Asia. So let me ask you one question before I go into the, some of the details. What is the definition of the security in the encyclopedia? If you take a look at it, one of the definition is feeling safe. That's what security means. So what we need to do in Asia Pacific in terms of the climate security is that we have to let people feel safe. So then question is, how can you do it, right? And then threat means that we don't feel that safe, even by listening to that. And then if I want to make you feel safe, then I need to address the immediate threats, right, measures, so that we can avoid that immediate threats. But that's not enough. We need to ultimately find out the fundamental solutions that will prevent the threats from not happening to us. In this sense, let me just compare some of the situation between in the United States and in Asia Pacific by looking at the same impact to the society. I'm sure that everybody in this room still remember 2005 when the Hurricane Katrina hit the United States. Do you know how many people lost their lives at the time? About 10 to 2,000 people. It was a great loss. Similar size of the typhoon, it's like hurricane in Asia, hit Philippines. Do you know how many people lost their life? 12,000 people with the same impact to the society. But in the United States, you lost a lot, but 12 times more people lost their lives in Philippines. That's my starting point, why Asia Pacific is important. By the way, if you take a look at the study by the scientists about why Asia Pacific is important, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, more than 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions will come from Asia. That's a lot. And under the UNFCCC, UN rule, climate change rule, do you know what? Up until Paris Agreement was adopted, Kyoto Protocol said that only developed countries take the legally binding responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In Asian context, there are only almost one country belonging to that category, that's Japan. Other than Japan, including Korea, actually, we didn't have to do anything. Who is the number one emitter in the world now? In China, right? And then I'm sure that India will sooner or later replace that seat. And then Korea is number 7. And then we have other countries. But Asia doesn't have any institutional basis actually to address climate change, even if the impact is greater than in the United States. Then question is, I said, what is the fundamental solution that we have to find out? Long-term solution, right? Where does that threat come from? That's human activities, right? And then fundamentally, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. By the United States only? No. What I'm talking about, Asia is becoming an engine of growth of the world, right? China, Korea, Japan, these days Vietnam is booming, and we know next destination is India, and do you want to include the Middle East as well? So it's an engine of growth, not taking any legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And here, if you ask even Korea, to me, would you want to take legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Of course not. If I think about national interest, right? And you have to design the institutions and governance scheme in Asia actually where players can comfortably follow the rule, thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions. How to do it? What are needed, right? That's what we need to think about. Number one, going back to Philippines case, many Asian countries, Asia is very diverse, but many Asian countries lack capability. right? So we need to help them. We are talking about some of the smaller countries in Pacific region. They don't have a capacity to cope with these threats. And they turn it into a matter of the opportunity by growing your economy, introducing low carbon technologies. So they don't have a capacity. You go to even the Africa, they want to grow their economy, but they don't have a capacity. So we need to have capacity building process. Not in Northeast Asia though, right? If you go to Japan, we don't have to work on it. We are talking about some part of Asia, right? Number two, as I said, governance matters. Are we talking about only Pacific region or Northeast Asia, South Asia, including Middle East? We don't have forum here, right? Of course, climate is a global problem. That's true. But do you know what the Paris Agreement means, which governs the society now to address climate change? It gives the whole driver to the hands of the individual states by focusing on the implementation, not regulation. Meaning that, asking countries to develop their 5-year low carbon development plan, we call it as a National Determined Contribution, NDC, submitted to UNFCCC every 5 years. We are not going to enforce you to do so. We just review it, encourage you to, constantly implement your growth plan. It's good for everybody. So because it's a matter of implementation by individual country, there is increasing more opportunities for countries to work together with neighboring countries, right? You go to Northeast Asia, John said that we are not going to talk about North Korea today. I have a lot to say in climate context. I have in my mind how two Koreas can be unified only thinking about the climate change. I have good solutions. I'm just waiting for another president candidate to take my idea. Because do you know why? Climate change is a matter of opportunity. Last week in Madrid, North Korean delegation even came and they said they'd like to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they will do so more if Indonesian society helps them to do so. So it's about the development, okay? But we don't have a governance system at the regional level in place. Of course, thinking about the immediate threat, you need to set up the sort of the regional disaster risk management system and some other things and sea level rise, right? That's necessary, but that's not all. You need to have a regional economic development forum, right? Which focuses on low carbon technologies. Do you know what is the size of this at the global level in terms of market size? Some people say 2% of the global GDP. As I said, Asia is engine of growth of the world. So there is a vast amount of the market potential. Do you know I'm sure that you heard about the Saudi Aramco going to IPO these days. Do you know why? Because they want to transform their energy system from fossil fuel to renewables. To do so, they need to have a bit more financial resources. That's why they decided to open some part of their big company to the world. Everybody is ready, right? And then also, there is another issue that the Asia society needs to think about. Is there any governing systems of supporting the financial institutions in Asia? That's another issue. We have AIIB promoted by China. Do you know what is the largest climate change finance organization in the world at this time? That's Green Climate Fund, which is located in Republic of Korea. Do you know have you ever heard about the Global Green Growth Institute? This new intergovernmental organizations having more than 30 countries as members. What is the focus of this organization? It helps developing countries to identify their path of growth in a low carbon way. Right? It is based in Republic of Korea. Why? Because Asia society is so important. Of course, Korea was lucky enough to get some of them, but not because of the Korea, but in general, Asia society has a lot of potentials. Here, my point. Asia society Asia Pacific has a lot of problems in terms of being exposed to the threats. But depending on how we work together, we can transform this society in a very safe place where everybody feels safe. And then there are a lot of good opportunities, especially the United States can work together in Asia. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Caballero-Anthony.
Thank you. The problem with you're the last speaker is most of this, your panelists have already said, I actually have a lot of notes. So, but anyway, before that, really thanks to Brookings for organizing such a timely meeting. And also for giving me the opportunity to join this panel and to tell you more about the Asian story that has already been talked about very often. Dr. Jun talked about how Asia can actually work together. The impact of climate change, as many of you already know, is not just cross-cutting, but it also has this really transnational impact. What happens in one state affects the other. So when you talked about having institutions, governance institutions, and particularly for countries that are really, really facing, directly exposed to many of the climate, the impact of climate change, what you need, therefore, is perhaps, apart from understanding what the risk is then to say, so what do you do? We have witnessed the frustration at the international level when countries try to negotiate emission targets. But at the same time, while the negotiation is happening at the global level, there's a realization that you also have to help countries deal with the day-to-day security challenges. So in other words, the adaptation response and the adaptation capability. So what I'd like to do in the very short time allotted to me is to just highlight three key issues, important critical issues in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, because as you mentioned, 4 or 5 of countries in Southeast Asia are really, in terms of most climate vulnerable. You're talking about Indonesia, you're talking about Vietnam, you're talking about the Philippines, Myanmar. These are all highly exposed. And so when you talk about the impact on displacement, and this is where I refer to my notes, really, as just for 2018 alone, the number of people that have been displaced, new displacement in the region is really close to over 68 million people. 5 countries of these countries, the new displacement also is not just from natural disasters, but also natural disasters coupled with conflict, existing conflict. So you have in the Philippines, close to 3.9 million people. In Indonesia, 857. In Myanmar, if you don't include the Rohingya population that is also suffering, highly exposed to natural disasters, you also have just conservatively 340,000 people. So what do you do with this new displacement? And how do you deal with the frequency of natural disasters? How can the region help in dealing with search and rescue operations, providing assistance to those that have been affected by natural disasters? So this is shaping the discourse in Southeast Asia, and if you talk about regional cooperation within Southeast Asia, one of the biggest agenda is really to deal with disasters is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So apart from ensuring that you are able to get countries to help, providing logistics, for example, getting volunteers out there, but you need to have people that can easily be deployed so that you are able to then have what they call an assessment group. This was very difficult in 2008 when Cyclone Nargis came to affected Myanmar. It was very difficult to bring assistance in. And as a result of that, there's a long story behind it, and I'm sure you know, but as a result of that, the region decided to have a legally binding agreement. The ADMIR, the ASEAN Disaster Management measures for emergency response, which allows countries, of course, to then provide immediate assistance. And as a result of that, you have now a mechanism in the region called the AHA Center, the ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance, that can then coordinate assistance to the region. So when Cyclone Typhoon Haiyan happened, despite all the imperfections of this regional mechanism, we were able to send people to come in and to provide assistance to local governments. You're able to send in and coordinate some of the assistance coming from foreign governments. And as this AHA Center gets more improved in terms of being able to forecast natural disasters, help provide alert assistance, and at the same time build the capacity of individual countries to have what they call the National Disaster Management Mechanism that meets every year. They share experiences. Then while you cannot prevent disasters from happening, at least you're able to help people respond to the disasters and at least prepare. So you won't have an instance where when you run out of medicine, when you don't have enough food, you don't have enough tents, then, what do? The region should be able to provide assistance to a neighbor that has suffered from natural disasters. There are, of course, controversies. How do you deal with countries that are not, that don't welcome assistance, immediate assistance, because being able to open your doors to immediate assistance will also expose your own weaknesses. So what happens in the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercise is to be able to build confidence and trust, among neighbors that we don't have enough capability and we need help, and it also means telling us from them what needs to be improved. The second is really having to do with the impact of too much water or too little water in terms of food security. Asia is known to be a food basket to many parts of the world, but it also continues to suffer as a result of natural disasters, already very real challenges to food resources. In terms of yield, for example, there is a reduction, not just in food stocks in terms of cereals, but also in terms of fish stocks. So what do? What's happening in the region is try to be able to develop, you're talking about building resilience, to develop what you call climate-smart technologies. How do you help countries develop this technology given the fact that production would be constrained as a result of climate change? Now, it's important to note that climate change, as a result of climate change, you're also seeing a region that for the longest time, you see a lot of millions of young children actually suffering from undernourishment. In East Asia and Pacific, alone the number of undernourished children, more than below the age of 5, in the year 2000 was already 23.8 million, and that is expected to rise to another 15 million by the year 2050. If most of your undernourished and hungry people are actually in Asia, and including the wider Asia and also in Southeast Asia, can climate-smart technologies help? How do you help your farmers being able to address the prospects of lower yields in terms of rice, and which is a main staple in the region? Are you able, therefore, to use technology for cities? Make cities become your producers of food rather than rely solely on the rural areas. So can cities be given the technology to even grow rice? The discussion in the region, for example, is a small city-state like Singapore, where you have all this public housing. At one point, there were some ideas that you can actually have your, we call it housing, this public housing. On top of it, you can actually build rice fields. That's something to think in the future. Or you make use of vertical gardens to grow your own vegetables. So can a country that imports 90% of its food become at least 20 to 25% independent of food when it comes to, for example, producing their own vegetables or even producing things like eggs or the other ambition is some kind of smart aquaculture. So things like that. It's an opportunity that's out there. It's an opportunity that can be rehashed, at the same time addressing the real challenges of food security. The third is the challenge to health. Southeast Asia has a long history, most recent history of infectious diseases. We suffered from SARS in 2003. We also suffered from the bird flu, H5N1. And there was also the problem with the problem with the MERS virus. And as a result of climate change, many people already know that it will actually increase the incidence of vector-borne diseases. One of the concerns at the moment is what do you do with the transmission of new breed of mosquito diseases such as dengue, chikungunya, and the Zika virus. And how do you minimize or control the possibility of more cases of malaria or even waterborne diseases like cholera? The increase of rural to urban migration, the lack of proper urban architecture to support it also increases the risk of water supply contamination. So all of these scenarios are being played out. So what do you have? Within the region, as a result of SARS, in fact, the wider region, you now have a body that looks at, a task force that looks at the incidence of pathogenic infectious diseases. What they do is to increase surveillance mechanism. So as a result of SARS, we now have a system where health authorities think about providing a regional, just like a global disease surveillance mechanism, thinking about the possibility of having a regional disease surveillance mechanism. And at the same time, looking at the possibility of having, for example, a bank for vaccines. Now, all these measures were necessary then, but is now even realized to be even more important as people prepare for the impact of climate change. What that tells you, therefore, is while the region is very much vulnerable to the impact of climate change, there are movements that are taking place, institutions that are being developed to respond to climate change. Taking off from what was mentioned earlier, it's being able to understand that while your scientists have all the data, you're able to translate that from knowledge to actual policy and to actual mechanisms, at the same time raising awareness and getting neighbors to actually work together to respond to many of the shared challenges of climate change. For sure, there'll be difficulties. I talked about the problem of having to relocate and having to deal with displaced population. The region has its own share of guilt in not being able to respond, for example, to forced migration in the case of what happened in Myanmar. But now you actually look at the specter of one neighbor, Bangladesh, that is now thinking of relocating many of these refugees in another island that is also prone to natural disasters. And there's been a lot of talk when you talk about the linkage between climate and security, about the impact of this close to 1 million refugees. At the same time, they could also be possibly climate-induced refugees, and it's basically a double whammy problem for them. So the region is not is unprepared, but at the same time trying to do something to address many of these shared challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. I also have a couple of questions, but perhaps we have the same questions. So I'll take a couple, and then we'll kind of go down the line and see who would like to answer them. So I saw a hand in the back.
Thank you. My name is Michael Choi Kim. I have a question for Professor Jung. You have mentioned the Global Green Growth Institute and the Global Climate Fund. So I'm wondering, what lessons did the Republic of Korea learn from hosting those two institutions, and what do you think those two institutions bring to the table? Or after your COP25 experience, where do you think those two institutions could bring some new solutions?
Okay, there's also a woman here, third row.
Hi, my name is Karen Florini. I'm the Vice President of Programs at Climate Central. Thanks, Sherry, for highlighting our new study. I just wanted to make the offer to folks who might be interested in that the corrected elevation data are now publicly available for free for non-commercial use. And if anyone is interested in following up on that, please let me know. This matters immensely because sea level rise is not just a matter of the height of the water, height of the land, and as our new study indicates, the most widely used data set available to date has an average error of 6 feet. We've gotten that down to 4 inches. So again, if anyone's interested in following up on those data, I'm happy to discuss afterwards.
Great. There's also a woman here in the fourth row. Yes.
I have a question about the ice melting in the polar region and its influence on international relations in Asia. Not just China, but also our allies, such as South Korea and Japan, are also interested in the Arctic region, especially in the Northern Sea route above Russia, and not natural resources over there, because of the ice melting in the high north. So it seems that Russia is also welcoming their funds and investments for Russian LNG gas pits construction projects, such as Yamal project. So could you talk about your thoughts about what changes will be brought to the international relations because of the climate change in the high north region?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to add one question, and then we'll go down the line. So looking at and some of you touched on this, the intersection between demography, inequality, and migration. Across the Asia Pacific, you have very highly developed countries, and you have developing countries at various stages of development. And so, with the unequal impacts of climate change across the region, and despite ocean, very mobile and innovative populations, well, first of all, where do the migrants go? Where is the first, second, third kind of destinations if they predict they're going to be displaced or they have been displaced? And what is the responsibility of the developed countries in the region? And if Dr. Jung, if ROK government, for instance, has looked at kind of what the government might do in the face of migrants coming from the region, that would be very interesting. So there's that question, and then also lessons learned from the Global Green Growth Institute and what those institutions in the ROK can bring to the table. The woman from Climate Central talking about the height of land versus and it was more of an announcement than a question, but we appreciate that. And then the role of Asian nations in ice melting in the polar region. So why don't we start with Sherry? Feel free to pick any and all.
Okay, I'll take the Arctic question, and you could read my testimony before the Senate Commerce Security Subcommittee last week, where I talk about this extensively. So Russia is essentially militarizing and attempting to monetize the Northern Sea route now. With the sea ice is melting at the Arctic and the polar regions are melting changing twice as fast as the rest of the planet. We're seeing increasingly navigable waters. It's the rapidity of change is well beyond anything that has been documented. The permafrost is now collapsing at a point where it may even become a source of emissions as opposed to a sink in the future. So Russia, with the longest Arctic coastline, first seeks to monetize the opportunity to create a toll road across the Northern Sea Route and in the future have a shipping route that stretches from Shanghai to Hamburg and is available to, for Asia and other shippers who want to both seek the vast energy and other natural resources in the region, but also eventually use it for destination shipping. At the same time, Russia has remilitarized many parts of the Arctic, rebuilding its bases. It's put a lot of nuclear, it's got nuclear icebreakers. It's developing the first nuclear-armed vessel that will take operation in 2023. So there are a lot of activities occurring there that are deeply concerning from a security standpoint. At the same time, they've been open to a great deal of Chinese and other foreign direct investment to help build out Yamal and other energy opportunities across the region. They need both financing and, in some cases, they need technology. So China has seen this as an opportunity, declared itself a near-Arctic stakeholder, is seeking to build a sort of polar Silk Road that takes advantage of the Northern Sea Route and potentially in the future a Central Arctic route if that should open up in decades hence. Japan and South Korea certainly have, and Singapore and others have already been very much involved in Arctic research. Svalbard, which has a unique international legal status, which allows a sort of centrally a demilitarized island that's part of Norway, which allows for international research. Many of these countries have researchers stationed up there, are seeking to understand how the Arctic is changing so that they can be part of this whole new geostrategic competition that has essentially opened up because of climate change. I would just say on your last question on changing demographics of the region and how to take advantage of the talent and the diverse talent that exists across the region. One of the things I know that Indo-PACOM, and I'm sure General Vol will talk more about this when he comes up here later, is that there's now a law. There's a U.S. law on women, peace, and security, but there's an international mandate on it. And I think there are opportunities in terms of combining engagements on women, peace, and security and on climate security to put those populations most directly affected, which is often women and children, at the front lines of the solution set on climate change across many of the small island and developing states. It's an often untold story because it doesn't fit the current narrative of great power competition, but it's a very important opportunity, and I see from where I sit and engaging, most directly with our U.S. military that wants to engage not just on the military side, but broader sort of whole of government. And I think there are many ways in which that can be heralded and cultivated and nurtured right now.
To your question on how do we deal with the prospect of millions of people being displaced from coastal areas in Asia and other parts of the world, right? I think you're going to need several things. The first is for governments to have an understanding of where the receiver communities are going to be, the second line of defense, if you will. It's, of course, somewhat speculative, but you need to be able to model where folks are going to go. So we know, for example, that during Hurricane Katrina, 1 million people were displaced from New Orleans and surrounding area. 250,000 wound up in Houston, where they were largely resettled. The other 750,000 went to very many states. And so we need to be able to think through where are those receiver communities going to be and to begin to prepare them for that eventuality, right? And that means building infrastructure, in many cases flexible surge capacity, if you will, in education and healthcare so that they are ready to absorb some of those folks once they come in. In the case of New Orleans, the city of Houston was able to absorb those folks largely without too much trouble because it's a big economy and it was largely undisturbed by the hurricane. But what if it hadn't been Houston? It was a smaller place. What if it had been a city that had also been hit in some way, right? So we need to strengthen the receiver communities starting now. The second is to inject some programs that allow for immediate cash to those who need to make the move, right? So even in the United States, we know that people have a lot of trouble finding even $500 of surplus cash if they need it in an emergency. And with renters, we know from surveys that most renters would have trouble coming up with $2,000 to relocate or to move quickly. This is just in the United States, right? In other places, that's even more challenging. So are there programs we can put in place to provide that quick infusion of cash, small grants? In the case of Katrina, again, the government allowed folks to access their retirement or their pension fund money without a penalty. So they could just get that extra couple of $1,000s they needed to move. So are there things we can do to provide that quick assistance? The third is, how do you provide help so that those who are displaced can find a new livelihood and relocate permanently without terrible hardship, right? So these are things like coming up with seamless financial services so that you can carry your financial services, your bank account, your credit card, whatever it is, to a different state or even a different part of the country without having to start from scratch. How do you come up with some licensing requirements for certain professions that allow people to export, to move their skill set from one place to another, again, without having to start from scratch? Essentially, how do you facilitate mobility and reduce the transaction costs of folks who need to start a new life somewhere else? In cases of more low-income communities, as was the case after Haiyan, the Philippine government started to move folks who were fisher folk primarily up to the mountains, right? And quickly realized that they didn't know how to make a livelihood for themselves because they had no skill sets for their new location. So we need to figure out how to train those people and provide the resources necessary to help them make a new living wherever they are going to be located. Bangladesh, by the way, is starting to think of some creative ways with the German government to do that. Finally, on GGGI and the Green Climate Fund, I have a little bit of experience there because I used to represent the U.S. on the board of the Green Climate Fund, and I had to go to Korea 3 times a year for several years to represent the U.S. And I think what I would say is it's great that Korea took the opportunity to house and host these important institutions in its own country. It's important that it was in Songdo, the new sort of city that came up from nothing into a major hub. What I'd say is it's important to continue to internationalize that city so you can continue to attract people from all over the world who can stay there, right? It's been difficult for many years because it's been largely a city that has continued to evolve from zero. And now that it's built up, it still needs to be a place where folks can move seamlessly, again, in terms of financial services, in terms of language, so that it truly becomes an international hub rather than just a Korean city that happens to house these international organizations.
I can continue to have some of the explanation about the GGGI and GCF. Personally, I knew the GGGI before it was born. So I was a council member of the GGGI, sitting in the governing body, also member of the committee to host the GCF for Republic of Korea. Looking at these two organizations, there are many things that we can learn, especially from the developing countries' point of view. First of all, it tells the countries that climate change is not a matter of the cost, but matter of the opportunities. Taking one country example of Ethiopia that I'm more immediately engaged with, Ethiopia's NDC, and if you don't know the term NDC, it's a National Climate Change Plan, needs to submit to the UNFCCC. It was this organization which actually helped the government of Ethiopia to prepare for this national climate change plan called the Climate Resilient Green Economy, which is very, very ambitious to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 64%. Relative to BAU level in 2030. And then they engaged in the various policy measures with the support of this global organization. And then so it ends up with that the Ethiopian National Plan, NDC, has become one of the very best NDCs at the UNFCCC level, which helped these countries to get more funding than other African countries from the GCF. And then if we go to Ethiopia, Ethiopian Airline, for instance, has around 30 Dreamliners. So more than the Korean Air or Asian Airlines in terms of the defined aircrafts, which is very energy efficiency in fuels. Everything is in context of the climate change. They have some ability actually to draw the attention from the society because they interact with the major players at the global level with this organization. And then, by the way, if we go to Addis Ababa, their prime minister who received the Nobel Peace Prize, right? One of the main reasons why he received the Nobel Peace Prize this year is because he planted trees more than anyone else before. So that helped him actually to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. What I'm talking about, because of the political will. And then being associated with a very fine expertise-based services by this organization. Actually, some poor country has a vision to become middle-income country by 2025. So GGGI has been very much helpful in terms of the helping, working together with the developing countries. They also helped the Fiji, government of Fiji, actually some years ago, 2 years ago, to develop their national plan on how to implement the green growth. And then GCF is also very, very unique, not only because it is a climate change focus in terms of methodology. As you may know, that the private sector is more critical in terms of providing funding to the climate world. And then GCF has this very unique component called private sector facility. In other words, if a major country, a major company would like to go to developing country, but you're not sure about the political risk and some other risk so that you can make an investment decision, you knock at the door of the GCF. They will match their funding actually to risk this problem, so that the private sector can comfortably penetrate into developing countries. Thereby, you can help developing countries to grow their economy, creating jobs, and then the technology transfer happens, and then GCF only has this function. So there are some good lessons that we can learn. With two organizations, they now have more than 300 steps. Both the GGGI, GCF have more 300 steps. They were created in 2012. It's a very fast-growing organization. There are many good opportunities you can utilize by engaging yourself from these two organizations. So I stop here.
With regard to mobility, it's easy to have all these plans, and I think they're very important to prepare for the real possibility that, as in the context of Asia, but I'm talking about Southeast Asia, that you really have thousands of people going to be displaced as a result of natural disasters. But the problem, however, is that most of the countries are not really prepared to deal with displaced population. You talk about the case in Typhoon Haiyan, for example, but in conflict settings, like in the case of southern Philippines, it's very difficult. And this is where sometimes, while you have all these plans in place to ensure that you have the right relocation, you're able to provide for cash transfers, you have the surge capacity to ensure that you have medical personnel and all the other relevant agencies to deal with the needs of displaced population. There is also, at least in the discourses in the region, is that you really have to get the local communities prepared to accept this displaced population. Because most of the time, it cannot just be governments to deal with it. So we have this discussion about state plus mechanisms, because most of the time, it's your local societies, your NGOs that help make this displaced population more welcome. But when it comes to cross-border displacement, that is a problem. And this is why I think one of the best things that has happened at least at the international level, is this global compact of migration, which actually now talks about what to deal with climate-induced displaced population. And countries are, are they actually prepared to deal with this? You're talking about, for example, the displaced population from Bangladesh going into the neighboring India. I mean, migration is an issue, and it continues to be. There are a lot of things attached to it. And much as you can argue that displaced population have their own skills, that they can actually contribute to the economy, one has to, as part of this is where regional mechanisms are important, because you have to get the region prepared to think about the possibility of accepting and helping this displaced population. And you can imagine in a region where the bilateral it's basically characterized by very difficult bilateral tensions. India and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan. And we're talking about, by the way, as a result of melting, glaciers and all that, in the Hindu Kush region, for example. I mean, you're talking about the possibility of these regions really becoming water stressed. Now, as this actually have implications on Southeast Asia, particularly when it comes to the Mekong, and you have big we have China as a major player, and what about the impact of the possibility of even thinking about sharing water resources as a result of reduced water supply, and that is a major issue that is being sometimes is swept under the carpet at the multilateral discussion, but is an issue that I think the countries have to be prepared and how to deal with a big neighbor like China and getting them to play the role if they want to be seen to be a responsible player in the region, and all this talk about providing public goods. And that one thing that they really have to remember. Thank you.
Well, we're fortunate to have such a wide range of expertise on the stage. We're out of time, but thank you, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.